This show talks about books that feature mental health and mental illness topics. There are many books that include this topic, and my hope is that more and more people know about them because they help to decrease the stigma and help people not feel so alone in their struggle. I am your host, Robin Tamanaha, licensed marriage and family therapist. Joining me on this special episode are my guests, three guests, author Kiku Hughes, who wrote the graphic novel Displacement, as well as Gina and Renn from New Sun's Box. Hi, everyone.
Hi.
Hi.
Hello.
Yay, I'm excited. Thanks so much for being here, everyone.
Of course, thank you for having us.
Yeah. So what I like to do is I like guests to, introduce themselves, say a few things about themselves, who they are, what they do, anything else you'd like the listeners to know about. So I figure maybe we'll go around here and each of you can do so. So let's start with Kiku.
Yeah. So my name is Kiku Hughes. I'm an artist and writer, I guess, based in the Seattle area. And yeah, my first graphic novel, Displacement, just came out last year. And it tells the story about a fictionalized teenage version of myself being pulled back in time and memory to experience Japanese American incarceration alongside my grandmother, who was taken from her home at the age of 16 and forced to live in the deserts of Utah in a camp called Topaz.
Thank you. Yeah. Gina?
Hi, I'm Gina. I'm a recent college graduate. I'm located just outside of Philadelphia, and I am a half Black, half Korean. In Japan, it's complicated. Half Black, half Korean woman who identifies as queer and is really, really interested in diverse kinds of literature and all kinds of amazing art and stuff. And I wasn't saying that very well, but I, along with my business partner / BFF Renn, have started up our subscription box, New Suns, that aims to uplift diverse voices from authors who are of marginalized communities and from marginalized identities to bring their work and their art to a wider audience.
Amazing. Love it. Thank
you. Hi, I'm Renn, they, them. I'm Malaysian Chinese, and though you can't really see it, my shirt says Quietly Perpetuating the Gay Agenda, which tells you everything you need to know about me.
Nice. And also, as far as New Suns, I was going to actually ask that as well. So it's a subscription box. Is it monthly or quarterly, or how is it working now?
So we're monthly right now, but due to like some life changes that are going on, we're going to be transitioning to a quarterly box starting in June.
Okay, cool. At the end, we'll make sure to mention like the websites and all that so that the listeners can check it out too. Okay. So thanks everyone for doing the introduction. So just for the listeners to know too, this episode, like I said, is a special episode, and I was actually really excited to like collaborate with New Suns on helping to curate the box for this month. That was more the mental health theme, and Kiku's graphic novel was actually one of the books that I had suggested because I love it and it was great. And it also is within the realm, of mental health. And I think most people, they're probably familiar with like mental illness, anxiety, depression, all those types of things, diagnoses. I think mental health is still kind of coming around and like the awareness, it's coming along, which is good. But sometimes, people don't often know too much. I'll kind of just briefly just describe for the listeners, just as like a heads up. And of course, too, how this relates to the book. So when it comes to, a mental illness, not everyone may have a mental illness, right? But everyone will have a certain level of mental health, right? Mental health is usually like how someone gets through challenges or struggles or adversity or like something difficult that comes up in life. Also, their happiness level too with their life themselves or the outside world. And oftentimes too, mental health can in a way shape to how someone feels about themselves, other people in their relationships, in the outside world. And sometimes even outside factors, like whether it's a certain event, someone in their life, a relationship or something, that can also affect how someone is within their own mental health. Does that kind of make sense? Yeah. So when it came to Kiku's book, I read it and I was just so like moved because as we know, like this was a real life thing that had happened, and I think in so many ways, the individuals that were there in the camps, they were definitely experiencing their mental health in multiple different ways. Kiku, could you I know you touched on a little like how the book was like inspired, what it was inspired by. Can you tell us like a little more about the graphic novel?
Yeah. So essentially, I started writing Displacement during the 2016 election, and that was because there were so many similarities that people were drawing between the rhetoric of the Trump campaign and the sort of ramping up rhetoric around the World War II incarceration of Japanese Americans. And, there were a lot of Japanese Americans at the time who were, talking more about camps than maybe they had before, to draw that comparison specifically and to sort of remind the country of, the ways that this rhetoric, the direction that this rhetoric has led before. And because of that, I was really inspired to actually sit down and sort of research and write this story that had been kind of brewing for a while. I always knew I wanted to learn more and to sort of make something that helped me sort of explore this family history. But yeah, the 2016 election was really sort of the catalyst for that. So it takes place, the book sort of is framed in that time period. It sort of starts in the 2016 election. And the words that my character is hearing on the TV from Trump's campaign, act as sort of these triggering moments that force her to travel back in a memory, in these, what she calls displacements. And sort of, I wanted that to sort of reflect the ways in which the rhetoric really triggers a collective trauma response, I guess, sort of related to this mental health topic that you were discussing.
Definitely. And I thought it was so interesting too how you did that in the book where it was like the memory and then being like pulled back to that time. I thought that was like fascinating how that was done. Symbolic, but also very, very powerful too.
Thanks. And I definitely want to shout out Octavia Butler's Kindred, which was a huge inspiration to me, not only in terms of understanding like sci-fi tropes such as time travel in a new lens, but also just sci-fi in general as a tool for exploring these sorts of traumas on marginalized communities, and the really powerful way that reinterpreting these tropes can be done. And Octavia Butler was, of course, a Black author who lived in the Seattle area and who wrote a lot of really incredible works. But Kindred is one of my favorite books for sure.
Yeah,
and I really should say, cool. Sorry, Kindred also has that concept of being pulled back in time. She uses time more literally. I use more of a generational memory. But in Kindred, it's a Black woman living in the modern era who gets pulled back in time to the antebellum South against her will.
Yeah, that's amazing. So let's dive in. Renn and Gina, do you have anything like you want to ask or bring up?
Thank you. Well, since we just mentioned sci-fi and Octavia Butler, one thing that struck me about Displacement was how, nowadays, especially in modern fandom spaces, people, especially white men, are really quick to decry female characters and characters of color as an invading force or presence that, to their mind, is taking over a space that they see as theirs. And so it's really awesome to see how in Displacement and in Kindred, you show that in history, as in sci-fi, which is inherently rooted in history, there have always been women, there have always been people of color, there have always been queer people who are living their lives, and so much of that history gets erased when white supremacy, which is the invading force, moves into those spaces.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, sci-fi was pretty much invented as a genre by a woman, so it is just Mary Shelley shout out. So it is doubly ironic that it has been so sanitized and used as a tool, of white supremacy out of, Western hegemony to erase that sort of history. But yeah, women and people of color and queer people have always been doing the best sci-fi because it is a genre that I think resonates uniquely with people of marginalized identity.
I mean, I definitely agree with that. I think one book that we featured in our box that I honestly just think about all the time was River Solomon's *And Unkindness of Ghosts*. Because in that novel, not only is the main character, like gender nonconforming and like sort of like queer and genderqueer, she's also neurodivergent. And like I remember reading that. This is literally like a year ago, and reading it and being like, "Whoa, am I neurodivergent?" Because I think just like she talks. And it was really weird for me to like have graduated college and just be realizing that I was neurodivergent. And again, to see it in that sort of science fiction context, the way that she interacted with this futuristic world. It's about like this sort of literally tiered society for like going through space, like space human colonization. It's super cool. Everybody should read it. But when I sort of imagine myself in that sort of setting, which I find very easy to do because sci-fi is just in my brain, I sort of pictured and visualized myself in that society and thinking about it and interacting with it similarly to this character. And I mean, that's a very recent example of sci-fi, but River Solomon themselves like have cited like Octavia Butler and other luminary sci-fi figures, many of whom are people of color and queer people. So like, yeah, like you said, we've always been around. We've always been doing the most and doing the best sci-fi. So definitely agree there.
I love that. I think that's also, I think for me, like what had sparked the love for books is that it can be so powerful when you see yourself like within the book, and that's important to experience as well. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So out of curiosity, maybe we'll kind of shift a little here. I know you mentioned like the collective trauma, piece of the book, and when I read your book, one of the things that like stood out to me was like intergenerational trauma, and how it came through in the book was really, really interesting. And there's been like a lot of like research on like intergenerational trauma as well, like within the psychology field, and it's quite interesting like what's come about. I think there's been like research since maybe like at least the 60s, starting with actually going back even before like Holocaust, to all these like massive starvation. There was one in one country, there was the Holocaust, all these different events. And what had come up was so fascinating. One was like how, at least when it came to the Holocaust one, the studies that they found from the kids of the adults who survived the Holocaust, and it was essentially, it had come down to their relationship and how the parents kind of had communicated and interacted with them. And in all the studies actually too, which was like, stay quiet, like kind of be silent, being wary of others or distrusting or like being very, very fearful. And I know like, in your book too, there was like also, I guess in some sort of way of asking, did silence or just like the being quiet about things kind of influence parts of in parts of the book?
Yeah, that's a huge part of the book, is the sort of the lack of access to these stories and the reasoning behind, I guess, the generation that went through the camps, like the reason that they didn't share a lot of their experiences. And, that early on, that was kind of almost a frustration to me because my grandmother, who was in camp, died before I was born. So I couldn't ask her any questions directly. And, she died without sharing a lot of her experiences. She didn't talk about camp very much. And that was true for a lot of, other survivors of camp, they didn't talk about it. And, the reasoning behind that is so multi-layered. There's the trauma, of course, and not wanting to expose your kids to that repeated trauma, or even yourself to that repeated trauma. There's also the fact that, there was a wariness of staying very hyper-American after the camps and not complaining and not seeming like a bad American, quote unquote, by dredging up these injustices. And in that way, it's not just the memories of camp that are lost, it's also, all these connections to culture being lost because of this, need to be very white American, this sort of attempting to reach that proximity to whiteness that of course will never come. But, the ways in which people are trying that for their own safety in a lot of ways, not speaking Japanese, not participating in Japanese cultural ceremonies, etc. So all of that sort of was lost as a response to that. And sort of instead, there's just this silence, there's this sort of understanding in the later generations that something is missing. We're not getting all the information, but and that can, I think, cause a lot of difficulty when trying to, understand your relationship to your previous generation too.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Yeah, that's something I experienced as well. My grandparents didn't really talk so much about it, but there were documentaries playing and all these other things, so that's kind of like heard about it, but it wasn't like actual communication. There was this silence, and also even I'm not fluent in Japanese. I know a little bit, but so it definitely continues. I know in the book too, it's interesting too, and this very much just happened. It did happen where they're in the camp, but then there's a lot of control. I know there was like that funeral, there was like, certain instances where they were not allowed in a way, like the people that were working there were like saying, no, you can't do that, you can't do this, especially when it came to like, even like a cultural ceremony or something.
Yeah. And I think that is, part of the reason that these sorts of things were so thoroughly squashed, even post-camp, is experiencing, up to 4 or 5 years of somebody with a gun telling you that you are suspicious if you do this, or you're not allowed to do that. You're not allowed to, have your Buddhist funeral. You're not allowed to, speaking Japanese makes me think that that you're spying on me or something. All these things that, become associated with this heavy anxiety and this worry about your safety and the safety of your children. Sort of attaching a baggage to things that felt very natural before.
Yeah, definitely. What was it, as you were like creating this book, like, I mean, what was it like for you to kind of, you mentioned there was the influence of the Trump, or, President Trump's, campaign, but then reflecting back, and it's really unfortunate how we tend to see these patterns or these things continue where people feel like they need to suppress or hold in or not speak their language, or now walking around being scared, I mean, what was that like for you to like be in the present with like, hey, this is what's happening like politically, but then also kind of reflecting back, to like previous time where something scary was also occurring?
Yeah, I do think it's empowering to have that context in a lot of ways. One thing that I wish that I could have talked about more in the book, and it was already 270 pages, which is so much, but one of the very first time, actually the first time that my character is pulled back in time, it's not to World War II, it is to the late 20s, early 30s, before, Pearl Harbor, before all of that, but she already sees in San Francisco this sign across the street from a Japantown building that her grandmother was in that says, content warning for a slur right now. Is that okay to say? I don't. Is it? Okay. She sees a sign that says, we don't want Japs in our school. Mm-hmm. And I really wanted to drive home the fact that these patterns follow very similar, I guess, timelines. There's always something that happens, or there's always like a campaign, there's always a rhetoric that happens, 10, 20, 30 years before the actual creation of these camps. And so part of my research into, for the book was, looking into this patterns, looking to things like the Chinese Exclusion Act and the naturalized, I wish I could remember. There, various immigration acts that affected primarily Asian immigration in the early 1900s, late 1800s, and the rhetoric that surrounded those, and how much ramping up to something like camps is necessary in order to open a camp and have the country allow, 120,000 people to be taken away from their homes. It relies on this, constant narrative of othering and of fear mongering for, years and years beforehand. And so looking into that, I think it is empowering because part of you can say, I am identifying this pattern now, and I know where this goes. And so here's what I have to do to, to try to stop it. Obviously there's, you can only do so much as a single person, but still, I think that part is empowering. And what I really want to say in Displacement is, memory is important. History, knowing your history is important, but only if you use it to actually do something in the present. You have to allow these memories and these histories to influence your actions now. Otherwise, there's no point.
I'm really curious to hear actually what the process was like for you researching your own family history, and how, I think I saw you mention somewhere that your real mother wasn't necessarily as open and forthcoming as the mother in the book. So what was it like for you exploring this complicated and incomplete inheritance of memory, and how did you go about doing that?
Yeah, it's true. I think my mom was not as open as the character in the book, who is my mom in the book. But one of the really great things about researching for the book was getting to share things that I found with my mom, who also had an incomplete history because her mom didn't share everything with her. But yeah, it was challenging because of that lack of, generational, direct contact with my grandmother. I relied a lot on libraries, of course. There were the National Archives actually has FBI files now that have been declassified that you can order. I resented paying $30 to order my own family's FBI file, but there you go. And so I got to read through, these old, government documents, FBI documents, relating to my great grandfather, who was one of the least interesting people in the world, but still has this thick FBI file on him. And I also relied on an organization called Densho, which is a local Seattle organization that works to archive stories from camp, archive oral histories, documents, photographs. They have this really great free encyclopedia of all these camp-related topics that you can read through. So they were hugely helpful in sort of getting the historical context. And really, I had these sort of tentpole moments that I knew I had to include. And these were things that I had grown up hearing about. The murder of James Wakasa was certainly one of them. The loyalty questionnaire was another. The horse stalls, that was a detail, and the dust. And these were all elements of camp that were so, I assume were so influential and so traumatic and so emotionally weighty that even through the silence of the generations, they'd been passed down to me. So these were things that I already knew. So those were the areas that I looked to research the context behind more. So that was sort of my process, but yeah.
Hearing about Densho and the kind of work that they're doing, it's clear that, obviously through works like this and organizations like Densho, the memories of camp and that legacy is kept very much alive. I kind of wanted to go back to something that you mentioned earlier, seeing these cycles and these patterns repeating. You wrote this under the Trump administration, which was very not good. And we've had the 2020 election in a phrase. And we've had the 2020 election. We've got the Biden administration now, and of course, like, there's a sort of new direction that we're going in. But of course, those cycles and the patterns that underlie them, have not just vanished. So I was wondering if you have any thoughts on, the sort of direction that may still be trying to work against the current, or the way that those patterns and cycles still need to be worked against to prevent things like camp happening again, even under this new administration.
Absolutely. And, I think one of the key ironies of the sort of neoliberals that try to blame Trump for everything is that FDR is still hailed as sort of this liberal hero, and he was the one who was president when these camps were open. So there is, I think, that irony that is not confronted by a lot of liberals today. And I think it is something that definitely needs to be highlighted, because obviously, there were family separations happening at the border during the Obama administration, and there continue to be during the Biden administration. And this narrative of, the sort of racist fear mongering against, say, Muslim Americans was happening from the Bush administration. There were, it didn't tone down during the Obama administration. There were, it's added by the Obama administration's, continuation of, forever war in the Middle East, and that is still going on. So these sorts of things obviously continue throughout both, ultra conservative, some might say fascist presidencies, and but they are kept structurally sound by liberal presidencies as well. So I do kind of regret how much Trump I put into the book, not because it wasn't a huge part of the story, and I do think it is a part of Japanese American history, because a lot of Japanese American organizations came together at that time to really do more work than maybe they had been doing before. For instance, there's an organization called Suru for Solidarity that came together in order to try to end the detention centers, the ICE detention centers. And so I do think it is a part of Japanese American history specifically. But I also don't want people to come away from the book thinking, well, phew, glad that's over, because it's really not. So yeah, I do hope that people realize when reading the book, and I wish that I had emphasized more, how one president is not responsible for, years and years of this same pattern. Yeah.
I think that is super important. Out of curiosity, I think everyone, right, could benefit from reading your book. When you were writing it, or even like now, do you have like certain people in mind where you're like, oh, I really would like them, to read this book, or it'd be great if these ones, did?
Yeah, I didn't, at the time when I was writing it, I didn't have a specific audience in mind. I think the only thing I had in mind was that I want anyone who reads it to understand, the intergenerational impact of these moments. However, sort of reading reviews now, I'm realizing that a lot of people who are reviewing it are saying, I didn't know anything about this. I didn't know that there were camps, or I only heard about this once in my life. And so I was like, that wasn't the purpose of the book, but I guess it's out there doing that, because it is a little bit shocking and tragic. But yeah, so I guess my audience would be people who now, I'm like, if you have never heard of camps, or of the Japanese American incarceration camps, yeah, that's the audience. I want you to know about this.
I think that's amazing too, that they came across your book too, and they found it. They were able to actually, learn about that, because, yeah, I mean, I know, of course, being Japanese American, like, I know about this, but even like other historical things, in events and tragedies, or the complete story, I didn't so much get an education around me sometimes. So I think that's great that they came across and read your book, so that they know about it now. And sometimes I think, unfortunately, it's us kind of getting outside sources or, outside books to kind of, gather, more information of the reality of what has happened and what's been happening.
Yeah, absolutely. And same, before I started researching for this book, there was so much I didn't know. And I think one of the main things that really like opened my eyes to the reality of what was happening, back then, I grew up with this idea, and maybe Robin, you relate, that, everybody in camp, kept their heads down, tried to do their best, tried to just survive this sort of gaman, just get through it and we'll be fine. I didn't hear about a lot of the sort of acts of resistance or the people that were questioning what was happening at the time. I just didn't ever grow up hearing about that. So when I learned about it through research, I was so excited to create characters that, were actively decrying what was happening to them in the moment, because, I think it's so inspiring, especially for later generations, to see that previous people were fighting this at the time. People were saying this is wrong. I think people get a pass sometimes. They think, oh, that was 50 years ago. Of course they were racist. But no, people at the time were saying that this is racist. People at the time knew what was up. So that was really cool. I was glad to be able to read stories of people who were, at the time very vocal and in resisting what was happening to them.
It's really empowering to read and to know those stories. I think for most of my life, I actually didn't know. And going off of what I said in the beginning too, sometimes you kind of learn how to navigate challenges or respond to certain things based off of what you see. And I think, for my grandparents, even after after the camp, well after my entire life, there was that keeping your head down, not stirring up anything, just staying silent, even if someone acted weird or outright racist or rude, or there was some sort of challenge. The message was essentially keep your mouth shut in a way, just because, and sometimes I was modeled because I saw them experience things and they were quiet, so reading parts of your books and even learning about others who, stood up, I think is so great, and that's empowering, and that's important to know for sure. Mm-hmm. Kind of goes against that narrative of be quiet,
Yeah. And sort of on that relation, sorry, I'm kind of pivoting as well, but sort of related to that sort of hidden history, and the power of seeing yourself or seeing, people who were authentically themselves in the past. I really wanted to shout out Jiro Onuma, who is one of the only documented gay men in the camps, and reading about his story and sort of the surviving documents of his life was so inspiring, and I had to include him. He's in the crowd scene. I don't know if you can. There's a little Easter egg for you. He's in one of the crowd scenes, because he was in Topaz as well. And so yeah, his story, and sort of he has photographs of himself with his boyfriend in camp. So it was incredible to see that and to see queer love thriving in camp, and it inspired me to make sure that I included my own sexual identity in this story. And my editor was like, was this allowed? And I was like, well, I mean, technically no, but look at Jiro. So I wanted to shout out Jiro.
Nice. Before we start wrapping up, is there anything anyone wanted to ask, or Kiku, anything maybe we didn't ask that you wanted to bring up or talk about or share?
I just did mine, so.
I just sort of just more of a comment than a question, excuse me. But so a really quick rundown. My Korean half is Korean in Japan. My Korean ancestors had to come over during the colonial period because Japan was an imperial power and it was awful. But there's the same sort of legacy of hidden histories of staying silent, of having to assimilate. I don't speak any Korean except for 안녕하세요 and stuff like 사랑해, whatever. But I speak better Japanese than I do Korean, and my mom's sister has naturalized. My mom's brother still sent his kids to Korean school. So there's a clear divergence in living the history and just kind of leaving it behind. So reading your novel and, or graphic novel, and hearing you talk about the process of exploring your family's history and pondering what it means to let those cycles happen today, when I know that my people are being erased from history books all the time. I met plenty of Japanese people who said they never knew there were Koreans in Japan, natively, over 30 years. So, just sort of seeing these legacies and hidden histories around the world, and the fact that these silences, are worldwide, wherever there is that generational trauma, was just super, like, really touched my heart. So I really appreciate, like, the work that you've done and you coming on the podcast today and sharing that with us.
Thank you so much. And I would be so interested if you are able to look into sort of Korean Japanese, communities, because I know Japan, the nation of Japan, has a terrible track record of suppressing those sorts of histories. And me not speaking any Japanese, I have no way to access that. So please keep in touch, and if you find anything else out about
Oh, absolutely. I did my thesis on it, so we can get in touch later.
Yes, please.
I got you. Yeah, Renn, you were saying, please, my dear.
Well, now I have a second thing to say. Jumping off of Gina's point, really quickly, I'm Malaysian Chinese, which is very different from being American Chinese. And I think one thing that you do beautifully in the book is make it very clear that Japanese Americans don't stand for the Japanese government or the nation of Japan. And I think that's especially important to remember at a time like this, when we're recording this within a week of the mass killing of multiple Asian women. And when I heard the news of what happened, I had that image, that panel from your book in my mind of Kiku and her mother traveling, being displaced to New York and seeing the newspaper saying Japanese American success story when Kiku had just returned from being displaced in the camps, and just the dissonance there is something that I think we're seeing a lot of in the news that's reporting on what just happened.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I do think, it's so complicated because the Asian diaspora is so varied. There's so many different experiences, but, to white people, it's all the same. We're all just Asian. So, talking about that and sort of peeling those layers is more, I think, very important, more than ever. And sort of the multiple facets that go into being an Asian woman specifically, and sort of the sexualization, the othering, the fetishization that has been so entrenched in Western history. All of that leads into it, and we can't go on forever about it, but yeah.
Definitely.
I'm sorry, did you have you said you had two things?
Oh no, sorry, the Asian diaspora being so different from the Asian nations that people's ancestors came from being different from the government was the first thing I should have made.
Oh, yeah. And there was a great quote from another graphic novelist who wrote Persepolis, Marjorie Satrapi? Oh, sorry. I know I got that name wrong, but I'm trying not to take too long to Google it, but who wrote Persepolis? And her quote was essentially, we have more in common with everyday people in other countries than we do with our own nation's leader. Like, she was like, I'm Iranian. Marjane Satrapi, thank you. I'm Iranian, and I have more in common with you as an American than I do with my own leader, and you have more in common with me than you do with your president. And I always think about that quote. I think it's so true.
Thank you for that. So, before we wrap up, thank you again, Kiku and Renn and Gina. This was super fun. So, where can people go to find out more about you if they want to? Is there like a website or like maybe specific social media handle?
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter. I'm at Kiku Hughes. And that's basically my only point of contact right now.
Cool. And Renn and Gina, can you do a plug-in for, if you like, your social media, or especially New Sons and the website?
I don't really do social media myself. You can get in contact with me through like the contact info for New Sons if you want to talk to me personally, or if you already have my email, you can email me. But for New Sons, you can find us online at newsonsbox.com, and all of our socials, Facebook, Insta, and Twitter, are at New Sons Box.
And what I'll do is I'll put all of this in the show notes of the podcast, as well as the booksbetweensessions.com website. I'll put all of that so then it's easily clickable for everyone. And Kiku, where could people go if they wanted to buy your book?
You can go anywhere but Amazon. I would prefer you not to buy from Amazon because they support ICE and are generally evil. So you should go to your local bookstore. You can go to your local library and hopefully they'll have it. Or you can support my local bookstore if you feel so inclined. They're Third Place Books, and they are a great bookstore in my local area, and I would love for you to support them.
Great. Yeah, definitely support local bookstores. It's super, super important, especially in the past 12 plus months or so during this pandemic, for sure. So definitely go there. Well, again, thank you everyone for doing this. This was super, super fun. And we'll all stay in touch, I'm sure. Okay.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah.
And Gina and Renn, thank you for your incredible subscription service. I think it's going to be awesome. I'm very excited for it. And Robin, thank you for your work with mental health. I think it's more important now than ever.
Yeah, thank you.
Round of applause for everybody. Thank you so much for your energy and for your work. I appreciate all of you so much.
All right. Take care.
All right. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening. Hopefully this was informative or helpful. If you think this episode may be helpful to others that you know, please be sure to share this episode with them. Resources mentioned on this episode can be found at the podcast website, booksbetweensessions.com. The social media handles and website for today's guest is listed in the show notes and on booksbetweensessions.com. If you are listening on Apple Podcasts, please be sure to leave us a rating. If you would like to stay up to date, please subscribe to this podcast and follow the podcast Instagram, Books Between Sessions. I post multiple videos and lives every month, so be sure to follow our Instagram so you can see extra content. And if you have any book suggestions or books you would like discussed on this podcast, please send us a message on the contact page of the podcast website, booksbetweensessions.com. If you're an author who has written a book that includes mental health or mental illness topics and would like to be a guest on the podcast, complete the form on the Be on the Podcast page of our website. Also, this podcast is not psychotherapy or counseling. If you need to speak with a professional, you should find one local to you and contact them directly. If this is an emergency, please call your local emergency number or go to your nearest emergency department.